Hi, in this tutorial we're going to look at a certain quality of nCloth objects, and that is their collision thickness. Now I've created a simple scene with an nCloth object, just a polyplane, and a what's called an nCloth passive object, which is just an object with which nCloth objects can collide, and you can create that down here under the nCloth menu, create passive out of any piece of polygon geometry. So if we look at this polyplane, you can see it's infinitely thin. It's just a flat piece of geometry. It actually has no thickness. But if we look at the attribute editor for the nCloth shape, down here you can see there is a thickness value here. And that's the thickness that it's being calculated as, how close it can get to objects and how it will fold on itself, how it will deform. So the calculator thickness uh, will will influence the types of deformations that happen to the object. So it's quite important. So I've saved out a couple of animations. First, with this as a thick object, if we look at you can look down here, there's a thing called solver display, and I can turn on collision thickness. And this gives a visual representation of how thick Maya is calculating it as. Now, this isn't how thick it will render. Of course, this is just for its calculation. It will always just render as a thin object if left in this state. So if I just play this animation, you can see it falls, hits this object, and the types of folds it makes. You can see these big, thick folds. It's sort of like uh, like a canvas or something, that a piece of cloth that has some sort of thickness to it. Now, if I just play another animation, just turn off that one. I'll talk about caching animations or caching simulations later. Turn on the thin animation. So now it's being calculated as if it was 10 times thinner. So like a thin piece of silk or something rather than canvas. So play this. So you can see how it's sort of folding in on itself, and it can, when it falls down, it folds over top of itself in ways that the thick one couldn't. You can see that it can fold in this sort of way. You can imagine the piece of cloth that was thick, like we saw before, couldn't do this sort of folding on itself. Just play that again. So we can see here the way, because it's thinner, it can fold like this. So, and also you can see that this one slides off, even though the friction settings and everything else are set the same. It's just the way it can deform and cause it to react in different ways. So that's great for most of the time, and it's just a good thing to know about, that you can change the collision thickness. Just one last thing I'd like to point out. When we look at it, you can see that there is a space here between the two objects. You have to remember that this object has a collision thickness too, even though it's a passive object. So the space between them is the thicknesses of the two of them added together. So I'm just going to turn off those two little animations that I made, or those two caches. And like I say, we'll talk about that later. And I have to go back to playing every frame rather than play real time. So let's say we want to actually have this render as a thick object. Now, the first solution that may seem obvious is that you simply create a thicker object. Rather than just creating a polyplane, you create something like a polycube. Scale it up into the shape and size that you want, something like this, of course, with more resolution. But the thing you have to remember is that the collision thickness is always outward from the surface. So Maya would not treat this like a thick solid object. It would treat it like a thick hollow object, and so it would collapse on itself. So it doesn't work that way. Sometimes that's the effect that you want, and you can control the internal pressure of these objects, so you can get that sort of effect where it won't collapse on itself. But there's an easier way to do it. So if we take this object again, now the thickness of this one is set to 0.4. This is the thick animation that you saw before, so it's something like this. Now I just want to model it so it matches this shape now. Rather than doing it before I turn it to an nCloth, I want to model it now to match the collision thickness that I've set for it as an nCloth. But you've got to do this with history turned on so it remembers all these things that you change about it. So let's look at it in the side view so we can see it. So this green line in the middle is our nCloth object, and this purple object around it is the representation of its collision thickness. So if I go into vertex mode and I'm going to grab these things, and what I want to do is move this object down to the bottom of the collision thickness and then extrude out the faces to match the shape of this. Now, one of the important thing here is that it always has to record in history what you're doing. If I were just to grab these vertices and move them down, Maya doesn't record component transformations just on their own. It's not part of construction history. But there is a function under Edit Mesh called Transform Component for when you do want to move components and have that recorded in history. So I'm going to make sure I use that tool to do it. Move it right down there. And then go into face mode. And I'm going to extrude these up. Now, of course, an extrude is its own action, so it will be recorded as its own node in the construction history. Make sure keep faces together is turned on, say extrude. And now make sure you use this handle to pull it up. Don't go into extrude and then just use the transform handle, your typical transform handle to move these faces up, because Maya won't record that in history. You have to use the extrude tool actually to pull these faces up till it matches the shape. Okay. Let's go back to object mode. So you can see inside here, if I turn off my solver display now, you can see I've got a thick object. And now if I play my animation, it should collide properly, like a falling futon or something. And it shouldn't collapse in on itself. It should behave like a thick object. Yep, and it seems to be working. Great. So, and then you can always smooth this after as well if you want to get a little more resolution there. Not resolution for simulation, but resolution for rendering. There you go. So that's how you can create a thick looking nCloth object that acts as if it were solid. Okay, thanks.